They say your home is your castle, the one place where you should feel safe. But what happens when someone decides they have more control over your property than you do? What happens when a power-hungry HOA tyrant decides to make an example out of you? I found out the hard way when I walked outside and saw a cement truck dumping thousands of pounds of concrete straight into my pool. My stomach dropped. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't just vandalism, this was war. I could barely process what I was seeing. My beautiful, crystal-clear pool was being buried alive, the sparkling blue water disappearing beneath thick, gray cement. Before we begin, let us know where you are watching us from in the comment, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Miss Karen Miller, the HOA president, stood at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, smug as ever. She wasn't just watching, she was enjoying this. "You were warned," she said, her voice dripping with fake authority. "The HOA doesn't tolerate rule breakers." I could barely breathe. This was insane. She had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. But what she didn't know, what she never even considered, was that she had just committed a felony. A few months earlier, I had moved into what I thought was the perfect neighborhood. Nice houses, quiet streets, friendly neighbors, at least that's what I believed before I met her. Karen wasn't just any HOA president. She was the kind of person who thrived on control, who lived for ridiculous rules and outrageous fines. At first it was small things. A letter about my trash cans being too visible. A warning that my grass was half an inch too tall. Petty, annoying, but nothing I couldn't handle. Then the real battle began. Karen decided she had a problem with my pool. It had been installed years before I even moved in, fully permitted, completely legal. But that didn't matter to her. According to Karen, it didn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. I laughed when I got the first notice, thinking there was no way she could do anything about it. I was wrong. The warnings escalated. Letters turned into fines. She accused me of violating HOA policies that didn't even exist. She showed up at my door, fake smiling through gritted teeth, warning me that action would be taken if I didn't comply. I stood my ground. The pool wasn't going anywhere. And that's when Karen decided to show me just how far she was willing to go. The morning it happened, I had just come home from work. I stepped out of my car and immediately heard it, the grinding sound of machinery, the heavy thud of something being poured. My gut told me something was wrong. I ran to my backyard, and that's when I saw it. A cement truck. Workers dumping cement into my pool. Karen standing there with her arms crossed like she was some kind of queen. Panic surged through me. I yelled, ran towards the workers, but it was too late. The damage was done. My pool, the pool I had spent thousands on, the pool my kids loved, the pool that had been perfectly legal, was being filled right in front of my eyes. I turned to Karen, shaking with rage. She didn't flinch. "This is what happens when you don't follow the rules," she said, smirking. My fists clenched. My head spun. But before I could even process what to do next, one of the workers hesitated, looking at me, then at Karen. And that's when I realized Karen had lied to them. They thought they were following HOA orders. They had no idea they were destroying private property. The police were called. And that's when things really started to spiral out of control. The wail of sirens cut through the morning air like a blade. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the thick, wet cement now hardening in my pool. My hands shook with a mixture of rage and disbelief as the officers stepped out of their cruiser. This was beyond HOA overreach. This was destruction of private property, and Karen had orchestrated the whole thing with a smug grin on her face. One of the officers, a tall, no-nonsense type, walked up and surveyed the scene. His eyes flicked from the cement truck to the workers, who were starting to look uneasy. Then he turned his gaze to me. "What's going on here?" I opened my mouth, but before I could even get a word out, Karen stepped forward, arms crossed like she owned the entire neighborhood. "Thank goodness you're here, officer," she said, her voice dripping with fake relief. "We had to take emergency action against a homeowner violating HOA policy. He refused to comply, so we were left with no choice but to enforce the rules." The officer turned back to me. "Is that true?" My blood boiled. "No, it's not true. She ordered this without my consent. That's my pool on my property. She had no right." Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on. It was an eyesore. The entire HOA board agreed it needed to go." I laughed bitterly. "That's funny because I never received a vote. And I checked the bylaws, there's nothing about pools needing to be approved by the HOA. She made this up." The officer narrowed his eyes, then turned to the cement truck driver, who looked pale. "Who hired you?" the officer asked. The driver hesitated, glancing between Karen and me. Then slowly he said, "She did." He pointed at Karen. She said this was an HOA-mandated job. We assumed she had the authority. The officer's jaw tightened. Karen's face remained smug, but there was a flicker of something else now, something like doubt. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. This isn't just an HOA dispute. This is destruction of property. She didn't have my consent. She hired these workers under false pretenses. That is a crime. The officers exchanged glances. Then one of them pulled out his radio and muttered something into it. I could see it now, Karen realizing, slowly, that she might not be as untouchable as she thought. But as Karen was driven away, I saw something in her eyes. This wasn't defeat. This was a warning. If I thought Karen had finally met her match with the police involvement, I was sorely mistaken. The situation had only begun to unravel, and what came next was beyond anything I had prepared for. The next morning I woke up to a knock at the door. It was my lawyer, a longtime friend named Daniel. He had a look on his face that instantly made my stomach churn. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside and placing a thick folder on my kitchen counter. Karen had wasted no time retaliating. Despite the evidence of her crime and the legal consequences she now faced, she had filed a lawsuit against me. The claim? That I had defamed her, harassed her, and caused her emotional distress. I laughed in disbelief. "Are you serious? She destroyed my property, and now she's trying to play the victim?" Daniel sighed. "She's trying to turn the tables. People like her don't back down when they're caught. They double down." I flipped through the paperwork. She had included false claims, exaggerated accusations, and even letters from a few of her HOA cronies who had apparently written statements supporting her nonsense. "This woman is unhinged," I muttered. "And these people are just as bad." Daniel nodded. "That's not even the worst part. The HOA is backing her up. They're now claiming that you violated several HOA regulations, and they're threatening more fines." I felt my blood pressure spike. Not only had they let Karen get away with her antics for months, but now they were actively helping her. It was clear, this wasn't just about Karen anymore. The entire HOA board was involved in this mess. I knew I had to be smart about this. Losing my temper wouldn't help, and acting out of anger would only make things worse. If Karen and the HOA thought they could bully me into submission, they had another thing coming. Instead of reacting immediately, I gathered all the evidence I had. The footage from my security cameras, the police reports, the testimonies from my neighbors who had witnessed Karen's behavior. Daniel and I went to work. We crafted a strong countersuit, not just against Karen but against the HOA as well. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd show them that I wasn't someone who backed down. As the legal battle heated up, something strange started happening. Some of my neighbors, ones who had been too scared to speak out before, began reaching out. They told me horror stories about Karen and the HOA's abuse of power. Fines for ridiculous reasons, threats for non-existent violations, and even cases where they had driven families out of the neighborhood. It was worse than I had imagined. Karen wasn't just an entitled neighbor, she was a symptom of a much larger disease. Then one evening I received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "You need to see this." Attached were documents, internal HOA emails that had somehow been leaked. They detailed how the HOA had been covering up Karen's actions for years, allowing her to harass and intimidate homeowners while protecting her from any consequences. Worse yet, they had been misusing funds, pocketing HOA fees for their own gain. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the emails. This was bigger than just my pool. This was corruption at its finest. And now I had the proof to bring them all down. They thought they had me cornered. They thought they could drown me in legal fees, drag my name through the mud, and pressure me into backing down. But what they didn't know was that they had just handed me the ammunition I needed to burn their entire operation to the ground. The anonymous email was a goldmine. Internal HOA emails, financial records, even casual messages between board members confirming that they had been covering for Karen's antics for years. There were discussions about how they selectively enforced rules, how they targeted homeowners they didn't like, and even how they funneled HOA funds into their own pockets. I forwarded everything to Daniel. Within minutes, he called me, his voice tight with excitement. "This isn't just a civil case anymore. This is fraud, embezzlement, possibly even racketeering. If we handle this right, we can take down the entire HOA. But we had to be smart. If the HOA caught wind of what we had before we could take action, they'd do everything in their power to cover their tracks. We needed a plan. The first step was to fortify my own case. Karen's lawsuit was ridiculous, but it was still active, and I needed to ensure I wasn't buried under legal fees before I could fight back. We gathered testimonies from neighbors, compiled a timeline of her harassment, and secured statements from the police officers who had responded to my 911 call. But then, something strange happened. One evening, as I was reviewing the evidence in my office, I heard a rustling outside. I checked the security cameras, half expecting to see Karen prowling around again, but what I saw was worse. A man, someone I didn't recognize, was at my front door, his hoodie pulled low over his face. He tried the doorknob. Locked. He then moved to the side of the house, looking into my windows. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. "I have an intruder," I said, my heart hammering in my chest. The man seemed to realize he'd been spotted and took off before the cops arrived, but not before my cameras got a clear shot of his face. Daniel identified him almost immediately. "That's one of the HOA's contractors," he said. "They use him for violations enforcement." Violations enforcement? More like intimidation. The message was clear. They knew I was coming for them and they wanted to scare me off. Too bad for them, I don't scare easy. But this wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was war. I decided to go on the offensive. The next morning, I contacted a local news station. I gave them a taste of what I had: the financial fraud, the emails proving corruption, the years of bullying and harassment. I told them I had more and that I'd be ready to go public soon. The reporter's reaction was immediate. "This is huge," she said. "If we can verify everything, this could blow up." That was exactly what I wanted. I also sent the documents to the state's Attorney General's office, along with a formal complaint. If the HOA thought they could just slap me with fines and lawsuits until I crumbled, they were in for a rude awakening. But then, just as I was beginning to feel like I was regaining control, something happened that shook me to my core. I came home from a meeting with Daniel to find my mailbox stuffed with dozens of envelopes. At first, I thought it was just more HOA notices, but as I flipped through them, my stomach dropped. They weren't just HOA notices. They were legal threats, eviction notices, liens on my property. Even a notice that the HOA was moving to foreclose on my house for unpaid fines that, of course, were completely fabricated. And then, at the very bottom of the stack, was a handwritten note. No signature. No name. Just a simple, chilling message. "Walk away. While you still can." They were trying to break me. But all they had done was prove one thing. I was winning. Fear is a powerful thing. It can paralyze you, make you second-guess yourself, force you into silence. That's what they were counting on. They wanted me scared. They wanted me to walk away with my tail between my legs. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that fear loses its grip the moment you decide to fight back. And I was ready to fight. After receiving the foreclosure threats and the anonymous warning, I knew things were escalating faster than I had expected. The HOA wasn't just playing dirty, they were desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. Daniel immediately filed an emergency injunction to halt the foreclosure attempts. It was clear the HOA had no legal grounds to take my home, and the judge granted a temporary restraining order against them until a full hearing could be scheduled. That bought me some time, but I knew they wouldn't stop. Then came the phone call. A blocked number. I let it go to voicemail at first, but when it rang again, something in my gut told me to answer. A man's voice, low and calm. "You should stop digging. It's not worth it." I kept my cool. "Who is this?" Silence for a few seconds, then, "You don't want to find out." The call ended. I stared at my phone, a chill creeping up my spine. This wasn't just HOA intimidation anymore. This was something else. That night I barely slept. My security cameras were on full alert, every little noise outside had my heart racing, and the weight of what I was up against felt heavier than ever. Then just before dawn my phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. A single image. My house. Taken from across the street. They were watching me. That was it. That was the moment the fear burned away and turned into something else, rage. They had taken everything too far. Destroying my pool was one thing. Threatening my home was another. But stalking me? Trying to intimidate me into silence? No. I was done playing defense. I forwarded the image and the voicemail to Daniel, who immediately got law enforcement involved. But I didn't stop there. I called the news reporter who had been interested in my story and told her I was ready. "Let's go public," I said. Everything. By noon, a local news crew was parked outside my house, cameras rolling as I laid out every corrupt detail, the harassment, the fraud, the embezzlement, the retaliation. And I didn't hold back. I named names. I pointed fingers. I had the receipts and I was putting it all on display. The HOA must have seen the news segment because, not long after, my phone exploded with calls. Some from neighbors. Some from unknown numbers. One from Karen herself, though I didn't answer. And then right when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the police showed up at my door. Not to arrest me. To execute a search warrant. On the HOA. Turns out, the state attorney general had been watching closely. Between my complaint, the media attention, and the growing pile of evidence, they had enough to take action. I watched from my driveway as law enforcement swarmed the HOA office, pulling out boxes of documents, computers, and files. It was surreal. And then, just when I thought I had seen it all, Karen was escorted out in handcuffs. I had to remind myself to breathe as I watched the woman who had tormented me for months get shoved into the back of a police cruiser. It should have felt like victory. But something told me this wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The letter was simple but chilling. You've made a mistake. You think this is over? It's not. It was clear there were still people within the HOA who wanted revenge. But they had underestimated me. The evidence was now in the hands of the authorities and I wasn't backing down. The final showdown came in court. Karen faced felony charges, while the remaining HOA conspirators were exposed one by one. Justice was finally served, and the corrupt board was dismantled. In the end, I won not just the legal battle but my neighborhood back. The HOA was replaced with a fair system and Karen? She was left with nothing. I had fought back against abuse of power and I had won. And I made sure they all knew I wasn't afraid of them anymore.